Sorry. Ooh. Good morning. I started to have a conversation with Johnny down here and realized I'd turned my microphone on. We'll have to talk about that later. Oh, okay. Oh boy. You know, if you were standing at the planet's equator, you would be spinning at 1,000 miles an hour. But anywhere you are on the planet, we're moving through space at about 67,000 miles an hour. And you remember that next time somebody tells you to get a move on it, right? You're like, I am, 67,000 miles precisely. Life on Earth ranges from so small to so large that there are bacteria in which 13,000 would fit within a single strand of human hair. And then there are redwood trees that grow to 300 feet tall. When you look at the stars, and honestly, sometimes I think scientists are just making up numbers here. But you look at the stars, the estimated amount of stars within our galaxies, and there are several hundred billion in our galaxy, but ours is one of 100 billion galaxies, they say, in our observable universe. So scientists estimate there are 1 billion trillion stars in the observable universe. Again, that sounds like we're just starting to make up numbers. There's a billion trillion gajillion of them out there. But you know, that's based on an estimate of what we see and then an estimate of how many galaxies there are, and if that's still an average of them, either way, it's unbelievable to look at the planet and the creation and all that God has made. John McGee Jr., he was a pilot in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He died in World War II, but he wrote a poem about being a pilot and what it was like. It says, "Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbled murk and of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of, wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting winds along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew, and while with silent lifting mind I trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God." It's a beautiful image, thinking of being in space, being up so high that you feel as though you've touched the face of God. When the astronauts, the Apollo 8, were told after having circled the moon that they were able to speak to the world and that they had the largest audience of human ears anybody had ever had. What did they say? Does anybody know? There was a lot of stuff that they said at different points. You're right. Maybe they did in that one too, the Lord's Prayer. I know on Christmas Eve, the lunar module pilot William Anders began, "For all the people on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message we would like to send you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep." He continued to quote from Genesis chapter 1. Others continue to quote from that narrative, and then Frank Borman added, "And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth." Where did the universe come from? As a part of our Christian Evidences series, the second portion, today we are going to start with arguments for the existence of God from the universe in contingency, causality, and the fine-tuning of the universe. And we'll talk about those words in a little bit. It's important to note at the outset of a study like this that no singular argument for God's existence really does the full trick of providing the type of solid faith that we want to have. I think the closest one probably is the resurrection, but for example, it's a family of arguments. So if you proved that there was an intelligent being that created the universe, well, good, but that again doesn't get you the God of the Bible, right? That's a different question. Well, who is that being, right? And the universe's existence would not declare Yahweh, the God of the Bible. You would need him to tell us who he is, and he has. So then you turn to the arguments from the inspiration of Scripture and things that we talked about last week. I think the resurrection gets you pretty close. because if the evidence for the resurrection is good, and a man came and predicted and fulfilled his own death, burial, and resurrection, and then ascended to heaven, what he says, probably true. And he says God did create the earth, and the Bible is Scripture. And so that gets you pretty close. You still have to work through some other things, I would say. But it is important to remember this as a family of arguments. And we're doing sort of an intro to Christian evidences, so we won't talk about everything that could be said today, nor would we in the intermediate class or the advanced class, or there's just too much. However, we will touch on some of the basic arguments for this. The first one is the argument from contingency. What does it mean if something is contingent? What does that word mean? Yeah, it is dependent upon something else. That's the basic definition. And that's the way we use that word all the time, right? I mean, our plan is to do this contingent upon this happening, right? That depending upon this happening, okay? Depends upon something else. A contingent being or a contingent object for its existence is dependent upon something else for its existence, okay? So we are contingent beings. We did not create ourselves, nor could we have created ourselves. We are dependent upon something or someone else to have brought us into existence. We are contingent. We did not make ourselves, right? We're dependent upon someone or something else. So the argument from contingency is sometimes referred to as a necessity, the argument from necessity, or a necessary being. In other words, that's the conclusion of this argument, is that there must be a necessary being whose existence is not dependent upon another. This being is not contingent, but is necessary. They exist of their own nature. They cannot not exist. And we'll get to why this argument says that. Gottfried Leibniz is one of the people who's most famous for coming up with this, and he also has a fabulous name. So what he says must be true. Gottfried Leibniz says the first question that must be asked is, why is there something rather than nothing? In other words, why is there anything at all? In other words, it would be perfectly logical that the universe might not exist, he says. So why does it? So the argument goes a little bit like this, and I've tweaked his first premise because, not because I'm smarter than him, but because Leibniz goes on to add sort of an addendum to a question about the first premise, and I'd rather just include that in the first premise than have an addendum. I'll explain that later. The argument goes like this. Everything that begins to exist has an explanation of its existence. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, the explanation is God. The universe exists, therefore, the explanation of the universe's existence is God. The logic here is good, but the question still remains, are the premises true? An argument can be logical, but not necessarily sound. Logical means it fits within the bounds of logic as far as the argument's layout, but that doesn't mean it's true. For example, if I say chairs are blue, blue chairs are the best chairs, therefore the best chairs are blue. Okay, so that argument would be good, right? It would follow. That would work. Okay, but the question is, are the best chairs blue, and are these chairs blue? So we have to question those premises. Okay, so even if a logical flow is correct on paper, it doesn't mean it comes out to be a true argument. Okay, so this is pretty airtight. It's true. Or excuse me, I also think it's true. But it's good, logic-wise, but what about the premises? Well, let's start with the universe exists and just kind of get that one out of the way. This one is sort of a given unless you are to question in conjectural ways that we are asleep, that we are part of the matrix in a computerized system or something like that, and there are those who theorize this without any evidence, with complete conjecture, that all of this is an illusion. Okay? So based on everyday experience, the way we operate in the world, the universe exists and we exist within it. Okay? You can debate that, again, from a philosophical standpoint, but if we're asking from a scientific, empirically verifiable standpoint, does the universe exist and do we exist in it? Yes, it's perfectly logical to say that the universe exists. But what about the first premise? Is it true that everything that begins to exist has an explanation of its existence? Why not say, as Bertrand Russell said, the universe is just there, and that's it? Right? And that's no questions, end of discussion. The universe is just there. That's it. Perhaps we could say that. Reasonable Faith is an organization run by a guy named William Lane Craig. He's a great apologist. But they have some animated videos that I would suggest you just look up. You can go on YouTube, especially if you have kids. They're fabulous for them too. They're very well made. Reasonable Faith animated videos, and they have several that are just a few minutes long for this that are really, really good. I did not depend on showing them in here because I don't want technology to mess up and us not know if God exists. No, I'm just kidding. But so I do recommend those, though. I think they're really good. One of the analogies used in there, sometimes we talk about design with the illustration of a watch and its design and finding it on the beach, and that's a famous argument. But the argument from contingency is sort of similar for them. If you were walking along in the forest and you saw a round, colorful sphere on the ground, and you're walking with a friend and you say, "What is that sphere doing there?" And your friend says, "There's no reason it's there. It's just there. That's it." And then you just keep walking. That wouldn't be the end of the discussion. The natural conclusion would be, there's this interesting orb here. How did it get there? You would believe that it had a cause for being there. And if it was a little bit bigger, it would still need an explanation of its existence. If it grew as big as the forest, it would still need an explanation of its existence. In fact, if it were the size of the universe, would the size of it then mean it no longer had a need for an explanation of its existence? No, everyday experience tells us that what begins to exist has an explanation for its existence. If it were larger, would that change its need for the explanation? No. But wait, if everything has an explanation, what about God? This is why I think it's important to say that everything that begins to exist has an explanation for its existence. Okay? So Leibniz's argument doesn't say begins to exist. That's what I put in there. For me, it feels cleaner. He goes on to add underneath sort of another line where he says, now there's a difference between things that exist contingently and things that exist necessarily. Things that exist contingently are dependent upon another for their existence. Things that exist necessarily are not, and would exist no matter what. Many mathematicians think that sets and numbers exist in that way. Nothing caused them to exist. They simply exist as the basic pattern of logic upon which everything else is based. Now, whether you agree with them or not, what I'm saying is there are scientists who agree to this principle in the idea, even apart from theology, that there are some things that exist contingently and some things that exist necessarily. They can't not exist. The question here is a good one because an infinite regression of contingent beings starts to become illogical. Okay, so I exist contingently. That means I'm dependent upon somebody or something else for my existence. But if that thing or person is contingent, that means they depend upon another thing or being for their existence. But if that is also contingent, then they depend upon another. And can you go infinitely to contingency? In other words, does it have to stop? And if you continue that strain of infinite regression, it becomes a problem. Because you have to ask the question, well, where does that end, and what is the source, and is there a source? And all of our experience says that things that begin to exist have an explanation for their existence. However, is there a being or a thing, whatever you want to say that it is, an abstraction, that is necessary, that stops the end of it, that is where it begins? And I do, looking at it philosophically, say an infinite regression of contingent beings needs to stop. And so the question becomes, what is that thing or being that is necessarily existent? It is its own nature to exist. There are really only two ideas for that. It could either be, as Leibniz says, it's either God or abstract objects. I'll put a sort of a twist on the first one in a second, but either God or abstract objects. And the reason he says that is because it's either an intelligent type of being or it's a non-intelligent force or entity or abstraction. I mean, those are the two major categories logically, of what might be to be the necessary beginning and cause. But since abstract objects and concepts do not intelligently create and produce, they're not thinking entities, and what we have produced are thinking intelligent entities like ourselves, then what you see in the cause, you need in the effect. Okay? Abstract, impersonal forces that do not think, do not create intelligent thinking beings that begin to ponder about it. So what you see in the cause, you expect in the effect. So we're talking about an intelligence. And when you go on and you look at the fine-tuning of the universe, and of course the non-material nature of consciousness and all of that dictates that whatever is behind the universe, there is some intelligence there. And so between those two concepts, the abstractions, I think, go away, and you're left with God. And so that's the premise. Therefore, the explanation of the universe existence is God. His second one, the universe has an explanation of existence. The explanation is God. Where I would put a caveat on that is I do believe that, but I also think you have to go outside of the contingency argument to prove that that intelligence is the God of the Bible. I would not just say God automatically in there. Maybe I should have adjusted this more. I would say an intelligence. Okay, because I think those are the two categories, abstraction or an intelligence. Okay? And then I think that you have to go further to prove who that intelligence is. But that it doesn't come from just the fact that that intelligence exists necessarily of its own nature. Comments, questions, objections I can pass off to Monty Payne. Who's got the aspirin? It's early, isn't it? I wondered about this being early in the morning. No. Okay. Who lit the fuse? Okay. Yeah. It's a good question. For the Big Bang, you mean? No. Yeah, so that's kind of what the idea of the mathematicians saying. They think that the logic based on mathematics is a necessary existence because it undergirds everything, ones and zeros, that everything technically they say could be reduced to ones and zeros in the material world. Some would say, well, God, go ahead. Yeah, you would, absolutely. And it's the idea, some would want to rebut and say, well, but God is the only thing necessarily that exists. Therefore, apart from God, mathematics would not exist. God would create that. However, the other side of that is our mathematics and the logical system is rationality itself as an abstract concept. Is that just an extension of God's logical nature? Does he create a universe in tandem with his own logical extension? And so does it exist as an extension of who he is? It's really an abstract concept. Numbers, we can write them down, but they're an abstract concept. And if that logic is just an extension of the logic of God, well, then it is an abstraction extension of his very nature, which means that it exists necessarily because it is an extension of who he is, which I would say is pretty good too. There is this idea of the concept of the design in the universe, and that God will repeat that, and that you would see that intelligent design. And the watchmaker, the idea that, which is Paley, is a guy who's famous for his watchmaker analogy. If you saw a watch on the beach, you would know it was designed. It could not have come about by accident. Richard Dawkins, famous Oxford biologist, pretty very anti-religion. He wrote a book called The Blind Watchmaker. And a lot of the stuff they talk about is apparent design. Like it looks like design, but I can find flaws in that design. Therefore, it only looks like design because it evolved to look that way, and everything that didn't evolve to look that way just kind of passed to the wayside. So those things which worked well still exist, but I can find flaws within those designs. Therefore, he didn't create it very perfectly. Therefore, he's not a perfect God. But the Bible's explanation for that is pretty awesome. That's why the Bible has such explanatory power. Because what does the Bible teach about creation? From the very beginning of the Bible, it teaches that God made everything perfect and sin messed it up. That creation has been altered. So what would you expect to see within the physical universe from a perfect creation that has been marred by sin? You would expect to see incredible design, and you would expect to see it marred. So then the question becomes, where did the incredible design that was marred, is it possible that it came about by time plus chance, etc., or is the intelligence behind it too much to deny that there was something behind it, even though it has been marred? So the Bible does have an incredible, a good explanatory power, even from the beginning of the Bible, as to why you would see both design and mar in that design. That's not a shock to anybody reading the Genesis account. So the second similar argument for God's existence comes from cosmological. It's called the cosmological argument from cosmos, and we're talking about the universe. And it really is similar, but it doesn't argue from there must be a necessary being if contingent beings exist, because it can't go back forever. The argument is really about if something exists, is there a cause? Okay. Can it just exist for no reason? Does there have to be a cause? So it puts a heavier emphasis on that portion of it. And it goes like this. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Okay, so the logic is good, but the question is, are the premises true? Similar to the contingency argument, the first premise is perfectly logical. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. Do things just pop into existence from nowhere? Well, everyday experience and scientific discovery tells us that things that exist have a cause for their existence. We may then go bigger and say, well, but the universe didn't. But we don't, again, if you had the small orb, it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, why would the size have anything to do with what we experience? Also, if it is possible for things like the universe to simply pop into existence from nothing, why don't we experience this happening all the time? If it is possible for the entire universe, again, to pop into existence from nothing, why do we not experience this kind of thing all the time? Why is it not like watching a magic show every now and then where things just pop into existence out of nothing? Is it possible that things do that? In other words, if we're going to say, and a lot of naturalists who say, no, stick with the scientific method, get rid of the philosophy and the theology and all that stuff, that we are going to make our judgments based on the scientific method, an everyday discovery based on that testable method. Has it ever been a testable, verifiable thing by the scientific method for something to pop into existence out of nothing? Or has every single bit of scientific evidence and everyday experience shown that what exists is a cause for its existence, and we have never experienced things popping into existence out of nothing? It's the latter. So based on everyday experience and scientific discovery, things do not just pop into existence, and if they do, like the universe, why don't we see that happening all the time? The second premise, that the universe began to exist, is confirmed also by the second law of thermodynamics, which is what? Yeah. The universe is slowly running out of usable energy. That's not the most scientific definition, but that's what it means, okay? The universe is slowly running out of usable energy, which means if the universe had existed forever, it would not continue to exist the way it does now, because it would have run out of usable energy by now. Which is why a lot of scientists are abandoning the idea of an infinite universe and establishing that space and time did come into existence at a finite point in the past. Okay, we'll talk about that a little more later. But that idea, some have said, well, how are we, maybe that's the way it works within this universe, but how, maybe we can get more energy from somewhere else. So theories like black holes. What about black holes? What about them? Maybe stuff that comes from the portals from other black holes comes into the universe and produces more energy, which can then allow us to have more energy. Well, you still have the issue of how does that energy produce and create and keep the entropy of the Earth and the rest of the universe from going down. But also that's sort of been, at least from what I've read, some have begun to reject it, because if it were the case, then wouldn't it be that black holes, since they're not sucking anything out, then they're putting out, wouldn't it be the case that the galaxies with the most black holes would have the most energy coming into them from the black holes, therefore the brightest stars and the most vibrant stuff? But what we have found is quite the contrary, that some of the galaxies with the most black holes have some of the dimmest stars, which means that's evidence that that's not happening. Okay, so we've found quite the opposite of that. So the idea that something that begins to exist has a cause for its existence and the universe has not existed forever is supported by the second law of thermodynamics, that the universe is running out of usable energy. Also, if you consider some of just the outside of the law of thermodynamics, think about the threat level of comets and meteors that we have all the time. You know, there'll be every few years, there's another meteor that's going to destroy Earth if we don't figure out what to do. Where's Bruce Willis? And there's going to be another meteor, and it could destroy the Earth. And there was a meteor that destroyed all the dinosaurs, and I'm not saying that happened. But that kind of thing, and it's destroyed. It wiped out all life on Earth, and all. If that has happened, all of that within the span of time compared to infinity that we have experienced or project into the billions of years that model projects, then an infinite existence of the universe. How long is it going to survive at DEFCON threat level? You understand what I mean? The infinite existence of the universe would have been the demise of the universe, which is why that model is slowly being abandoned, I believe. So this is where, again, whatever begins to exist as a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe began to exist. In a panel discussion in 2012 on Australian national television, Richard Dawkins, who we mentioned earlier, was asked, how is it that something as enormous as the universe came from nothing? Good question. Dawkins says this. Interesting answer. Of course, it's counterintuitive that you can get something from nothing. Of course, common sense doesn't allow you to get something from nothing. That's why it's interesting. It's got to be interesting in order to give rise to the universe at all. Something pretty mysterious had to give rise to the origin of the universe. So according to Dawkins' own admission, it is against common sense to believe that something came into existence from nothing without a cause. Now he says that's why it's mysterious. And he just maintains the assumption that somehow it did, and we just don't have the answer yet. But it is, of course, he says, counterintuitive and against common sense to believe that it happened, but because we know that it happened, because there is no God, then we must just say, well, we just don't know yet. But, of course, that's not scientific. That's not a scientific answer. It's just an assumption. Modern scientific discoveries pointing to the cosmic beginning of time and space at that single point in the finite past caused Stephen Hawking to call that discovery the most remarkable discovery of modern cosmology. He says it has now been established, quote, that it is now taken for granted the universe has not existed forever. Rather, the universe and time itself had a beginning. If the universe did not exist forever and had a beginning, the question is, well, what is the cause of that contingent universe? And then you loop back to the contingency argument, and you go through that and come to abstraction or God or intelligence, and then you go from there. Biologist E.O. Wilson, some of these are scientific people. I guess they are scientific people. I don't know what that means. He says, if any positive evidence could be found of a supernatural guiding force, it would be one of the greatest discoveries of all time. In recent decades, developments are leading us to that. The book of Genesis is in its explanation of the existence of the universe. Gerald Schroeder notes, these commentaries were not composed in response to cosmological discoveries. as an attempt to force an agreement between theology and cosmology. Theology presents a fixed view of the universe. Science, through its progressively improved understanding of the world, has come to agree with theology. We did have this sermon on science, so it's difficult to have a class on Christian evidences without talking about the fine-tuning of the universe. That's one of the major arguments for the existence of an intelligence behind it. And we did happen, I did not plan it that way, to have the scientism sermon on that, but this does go all the way back to the beginning of the universe. You may not have been there for that sermon, and I'm not going to repeat that whole sermon, but some of these facts do bear repeating, if for nothing more than a headache. I'm kidding. The science that suggests an explosive force behind the universe is good. The cosmic background radiation, some of what we have discovered that shows the planets moving in opposite directions, the universe expanding out away from itself from a singular point, as well as the material that seems to have been pushed back as though the expansion within the universe had pushed that. And the fine-tuning of how small a chance it had to have been to expand the way that it did is referred to as the cosmological constant. Referring to the gravitational constant, though, the force of gravity that controls gravity, obviously, the gravitational constant is so small that that number is so small that 1 in 10 to the 60th power, if it were off by any part of that, then the universe would not exist. There'd be no planets, no stars, no nothing. Because the expansion of the universe, if it had not been at one time, all at one time, if it had not been powerful enough and gravity had been stronger, it would have collapsed it onto itself. And so gravitational constant was exact enough that it did not collapse itself. However, that had to work in tandem with the cosmological constant, which is the power of the expansion. Okay? So even if the gravitational constant remained constant, but the expansion rate wasn't strong enough, well, that gravity would still have collapsed the universe on itself. So think of the cosmological constant as a man who's bound trying to push out. And the cosmological constant is the expansion rate of the universe when it began. Okay? That would be me trying to push out. And the chains would be, or floss, that's all it would take. I'm kidding. The floss, or the chains, whatever, is the gravitational constant. It's the pressure holding me in. Okay? So gravity is pushing inward. Cosmological constant is the power with which the universe is expanding. If the gravitational constant is too strong, it doesn't expand. It collapses. If the cosmological constant is too strong and gravity can't hold it, the universe expands at once, but then it dissipates in all directions because it cannot be held together. So those two have to work together in tandem and be exactly right in order for the universe to have been created all at once and pop into existence. Okay? From nothing, yes, but by an external supernatural force. The gravitational constant being that small, well, some have compared that number to the amount of cells in your body, which is only 1 in 10 to the 14th power. We're talking about 1 in 10 to the 60th. The expansion rate, the cosmological constant, is if it was off by 1 part in 1 in 10 to the 120th power, it would not have worked. Those numbers are too large to even really describe with the zero. And the number that, and remember, you have dozens that science is discovering these fundamental constants and quantities in the universe that are so finely tuned to permit life. But they all had to work together. So just the probability that one of these exists in its precision is high. It's low. The probability is low, the number's big. But they have to also exist together, which means you now have compound probability. So Sir Roger Penrose, emeritus professor at Oxford, he won the Wolf Prize in Physics with Stephen Hawking, not an idiot. He calculates this and suggests the precision necessary is 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123. That's to the power of, that's powerful. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, secular encyclopedia, the apparent probability of all the necessary conditions sufficient to allow just the formation of planets, let alone life, coming together by chance, is utterly outrageously tiny. which is why Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, very heavily against religion, admitted that the strongest argument in favor of Christianity or God is the fine-tuning argument. He didn't believe it got you all the way there, but he did say it was not trivial at all, which is why Sir Fred Hoyle, examining the evidence, even though writing as an atheist at that time, said it left him greatly shaken. Andre Linde, other people, astrophysicist John Gribben, have said that maybe we need to look to extraterrestrials or some other intelligence that deposited seeded life on this universe. Whether or not you go with them on, or John Gribben says that that consideration by Linde needs to be given serious consideration. Whether you agree with that, some have talked about crystals and their ability and those being seeded here on this planet. Whether you agree with that or talk about the existence of extraterrestrial life, what it does say is that the fine-tuning of the universe and the intelligence behind it is so hard to get around that we feel compelled to come up with an intelligence, even if that's not God. Do you understand that? It is a backhanded compliment to the strength of the fine-tuning argument, that the level of intelligence behind it is so difficult to deny. The facts cause even Richard Dawkins to admit the possibility of intelligent design, where he says, I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry and molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer. Now, those things I mentioned in the sermon, some of those quotes, but here are some other scientists and some of the things they've said, looking at the evidence, finding it very difficult to avoid the conclusion. And these are not just they grew up in the church and so they have a jaded view. A lot of these guys are scientists who did not grow up with that background, who are looking at this evidence. Arthur Eddington, who finally conceded, said the beginning seems to present insuperable difficulties unless we agree to look at it as frankly supernatural. Arno Penzias, he won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of the cosmic background radiation that corroborated the absolute beginning of the universe, evidence for its expansion at one time in the beginning. He says, the best data we have are exactly what I would have predicted had I had nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole. One more. Astronomer Robert Jastrow, he puts it more vividly. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. James Denison, taking a look at some of these, the evidence for the existence of God and the fine-tuning of the universe, he says there are some quotes, he says, that bring this kind of to a more practical level of how we might apply these type of things. One is by a guy named Frederick Buechner, and it's that we treat God like the mystery that he is. As much as we can come to know about him, we know like nothing about the universe in comparison to what could be known. At the end of the day, we have to back up and have that humility. Frederick Buechner wrote, there are mysteries you can solve by taking thought. For instance, a murder mystery whose mysteriousness must be dispelled in order for the truth to be known. There are other mysteries that do not conceal a truth to think your way to, but whose truth is itself the mystery. The mystery of yourself, for example. The more you try to fathom it, the more fathomless it is revealed to be. No matter how much of yourself you are able to objectify and examine, the quintessential, living part of yourself will always elude you. That is, the part that is conducting the examination. Thus, you do not solve the mystery, you live the mystery. And you do that not by fully knowing yourself, but by being fully yourself. To say that God is a mystery is to say that you can never nail him down. Even on Christ, the nails proved ultimately ineffective. How should knowing the mystery and the majesty of God affect daily life? Yeah, you should have some confidence that someone else is in control because, as Jesus says in Matthew 6, the God, the intelligence behind the universe, didn't just create it. He created it and put us at the center and cares for his creation, the birds, the lilies, and how much more valuable are you, Jesus says. Good. What else? Yeah. Yeah, there is sometimes a peace in not knowing you, in knowing you don't have to know all of the answers, and that'll be okay. That's part of the peace of childhood. It's not when a child is scared that they come to you and they need an explanation of everything, but that they know that they're safe in your arms because you understand more than they do and they trust you. Yeah, and we were in the car a couple days ago, and Evie said, she said, Dad, if you knew, or if you were God, what would you do? And I was like, well, if I was God, then I would know everything God did, and then I would be doing exactly what God is doing. And he was like, no, like if you didn't know everything God did, what would you do? And I was like, probably all the wrong stuff. And you know, there's a part of you that says, you know, would I really want to know everything that God does and try to do what God does? No. Would I want to know some of the mysteries of the universe? Sure. But some of the inner workings and some of the evil of human hearts, do I want to know? Mm-mm. It leads us to worship, it leads us to humility, and I think it ought to lead us to share it with other people. All right, final bell. Any comments, questions before we go? All right, well, let's have a prayer. Father, thank you for the time we've spent together. Thank you for the incredible universe you've given us, for the marks of design you've put on it, and for telling us who you are through your word. Father, we pray that as we move into worship in this next hour, that we turn the awe that we see in creation into worship, even as we sing songs like How Great Thou Art, as we look at the universe and declare that to you. We pray all these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.